Obviously, it's a lot more work to do that. It can cost more money in the end, but it helps to preserve the wilderness character of the park. Because the site has a high level of use, we also want to try and minimize impacts to users while we're implementing this project. Like I mentioned, it's a small site, so there's not a lot of room to work. A big issue that we're going to have to deal with is disposal of the tamarisk that we've cut and removed. There are limited options to use there, and most likely we'll be disposing of those tamarisk in the river in a staged manner. Sufficient funding is also a challenge. As you can imagine, these types of projects can take years to implement, and oftentimes funding is only available for 1 or 2 years at a time. Availability of local plant stock. There's some restoration work that's been done in the Southwest and other areas where they will utilize plant materials that have been collected from areas far afield. As the National Park Service, we try to only utilize plant materials that are found within the local area. And because we don't have a standing stock of plant material, we have to collect and grow out everything that we plan to plant at the site. The site is also highly degraded, and so there's some uncertainty as to how successful this project will be. We may get there, get some plants in the ground, do our best to keep them alive, and despite our best efforts, we may not have a high success rate. Beavers are another issue. Beavers are native to the canyon. There's some information that indicates that beavers are in higher numbers than they were historically. Beavers love willows and cottonwoods, and so any plants like those that we plant at the site, we will have to protect with cages to exclude those beavers. Any of you who are familiar with the work that's been done at Lee's Ferry, those cottonwoods there have been caged, and those will likely have to remain there. Now, what's interesting is some of the work that Professor Tom Whittam at NAU have done, along with his colleagues. They've actually identified some, I believe, some cottonwood species that are resistant to beaver herbivory, and those are cottonwood genotypes that have evolved in areas that have beavers. They have high tannin levels, and so there may be some options in the future, probably not for this project, but possibly other projects, for planting different genotypes of cottonwoods at these sites so we don't have to use exclusion cages. But that opens a whole can of worms where you're essentially using genotypes that are found from well outside of the park. And based on policies, that is something that we would have to examine very carefully before implementing. Finally, maintenance and monitoring. We know based on some of the other restoration work that has been done in the canyon, or outside of the canyon, but upstream and downstream, that it requires a lot of maintenance to keep these plants alive. In some cases, it requires irrigation. It may require hand watering on a frequent basis, and usually for the first 2 or 3 years, you may have to maintain some pretty frequent watering regime to ensure success in establishment. So that's what I wanted to cover. I think there should be enough time for questions, so I'd be happy to take any if anyone has them. Yes?
I'd like to go back mentally, at least to the map of the watersheds that you had. What fraction of those watersheds lies within the park, and how does the program that you're talking about, which is called the Watershed Stewardship, differ from simply stewardship, taking care of sites in the park? What's the watershed aspect of your program?
Okay, that's a good question. So the question was, what's the watershed aspect of this program? Watershed it's a bit of a slippery term. In some cases, when people hear the term watershed, they think of aquatic resources. The way we're really using watershed is within a scalar kind of concept. So there's lots of different ways to look at a landscape, and one way, like I described, is using watersheds. And there's different ways to delineate watersheds. This is just one scale. You could go up the next scale, which would encompass even a larger area. You can drop down in scales. And so depending on what scale of watershed you're looking at, it may encompass different proportions of areas outside of the park. what differs in kind of this approach versus what's been done in the past is really looking outside of the park and particularly looking at threats outside of the park. And so we know things like uranium mining, historical uranium mining, current uranium mining can potentially impact groundwater resources. Those groundwater resources enter the park. Those are the sources for the springs and seeps. And so it's really important to take a broader perspective and to consider those issues. I think another advantage of taking this approach is that we have neighbors who may have similar resource management objectives, and some of those issues like uranium mining, regional air pollution, those aren't things that the Park Service itself can take on successfully. And so it's important to kind of find allies who have similar resource management objectives, and you can kind of reach some economies of scale in trying to deal with some of those bigger picture issues. Yes?
What specific watershed areas will be affected by the proposed growth in Tucson?
The proposed...
the steel appropriation.
Okay. Yeah. The question was what watersheds would be affected by the proposed development at Tucson. I'm trying to see this map here. So the Tucson would be probably somewhere around here. And so it would be those, could potentially be those seeps and springs that come out on the south rim. So some of those areas that are accessed by the Hermit Trail that I pointed out, and those, there has been some research done looking at the relationship between that aquifer and spring discharge, and that indicated that there is a connection between the aquifer that underlies Tucson and those springs and seeps in the canyon. Yes?
I have another question about the watersheds. As I look at it, it seems that some of the blue lines delineate areas that don't have an outlet. Are those bona fide watersheds in the conventional sense that the water flows continuously through this area and presumably ends up in the Colorado River?
Right. So that's a good question. The question was asking about how these watersheds were delineated and the fact that they don't appear to coincide with what some of you might recognize as major water features through the park. And when I first used this layer, the same question came to me. I'm like, well, where's the Colorado River? And if you look at it, USGS came up with this system. So like I mentioned, it's a nested hierarchical system that covers the entire nation. And it's composed of different scales of watersheds. And the decision rules that they used included the watersheds could not coincide with water bodies. So their decision rule was that you couldn't have a watershed that would coincide with, in this case, the Colorado River. So that's why you actually don't see the Colorado River represented in these delineations. But what you do see is, in this case, you see a watershed that actually spans the Colorado on both sides of the river. And so part of their decision rules was that they would delineate watersheds starting downstream of major tributaries. And in some cases, if you look at a map and you look at an overlay of the stream system, it makes sense. But there's other areas that seem a bit more arbitrary, where you might have what would be considered kind of a watershed in a lot of people's minds, let's say the Monument Creek watershed, and that might actually be split midway. So you might have kind of an upper watershed and a lower watershed. And that's something that we're going to seriously look into as we go through this landscape assessment. I think the way a lot of people view the canyon is that you do have main stem bisecting the park, and that is fed by a suite of watersheds on each side. And so we're going to talk with folks at USGS and some other subject matter experts to see if there's actually another way to delineate the watershed boundaries that make more sense for our own purposes. The advantage of using this is that it's a nationally recognized system. but it's not that intuitive. Yes?
So I was curious, you were talking about the girdling of the trees.
Yes.
Is that just taking off a portion? What exactly does that mean?
Yes. The question is, what does girdling mean? And so, yes, girdling is physically removing the outer bark and cutting into the cambium of the tree. With a normal tree species, that would often be enough to kill it. Tamarisk are really resilient plants, and for us to utilize that method, not only will we have to girdle them, but we will be injecting herbicide into those cuts, and that will kill them in place. And again, the reason why we're using that treatment is to mimic the beetle kill trees. So we expect to have a lot of standing dead tamarisk throughout the corridor. And so we want to see if those tamarisk just die. If there's a good response from the surrounding native vegetation, then from an ecological point of view, there might not be a need to do anything more. From an aesthetic point of view, people may not want to see a bunch of dead trees for the next century or two in the canyon. So there might be reason to remove them simply for that reason. However, if we use that treatment and we're not seeing good response from the native plants, or we're seeing other non-natives come in, then it might make sense to be proactive and plant some native vegetations to basically preempt invasion by other non-natives. We know that the conditions in the river corridor and the conditions in kind of a post-tamarisk beetle corridor are conducive to the establishment of other non-natives that we know are in the area. So like Russian olive would be one. That's a species that we've stayed on top of really well within the park, but that have invaded areas, like in Glen Canyon pretty heavily. So camel thorn is another one that we're battling within the river corridor. And brome is ubiquitous throughout the park, and there's really nothing we can do about it. Yes?
You said after you remove the tamarisk from the site, the site is degraded. Would that be from salt or other things?
So the sites I refer to as being degraded for a whole host of reasons. So you have systemic